30 minutes later, Darren was up on the spine, strapping himself into the pilot's rig of the Leviathan's biggest Huxley. She was exhausted and half frozen, but for the first time since the wreck, things felt under control. She and Alec had found Mr. Rigby in the sick bay, alive and well, and shouting orders from his bed. A bullet had passed clear through him, somehow missing all the important bits. According to the ship's surgeon, he'd be back on duty in a week. A message lizard had found them there, relaying the captain's plan in Dr. Barlow's voice. A well-armed party would escort Alec home under flag of truce, but not until a Huxley had gone for a good look. So Alex was struck on an egg-watching duty, and Darren was here on the spine, ready to ascend. She tightened the rig across her shoulders, glancing up at the Huxley. The beastie looked healthy, its membrane taut in the thin mountain air. Good for a mile of altitude at least. If Alec's family lived anywhere in this valley, Darren would spot them in a squick. Mr. Sharp, a voice called from halfway down the flank. It was Newkirk, smiling as he climbed toward her. It's true, you're alive. Of course I am, Darren called back, cracking a smile. Mr. Rigby had told her Newkirk was unhurt, but it was good to see him with her own eyes. He ran the rest of the way up, carrying a pair of field glasses in one hand. The navigator sends these with his compliments. They're his best pair, so don't break them. Darren frowned at the marker's mark on the leather case. Zesky Optic. Everyone said Clanker binoculars were the best, but it was annoying to be reminded of it. At least Alec wasn't here to make some stuck-up remark. Orphan or not, she had enough of his Clanker arrogance for one day, and the sun wasn't even up yet. Mr. Rigby and I were beginning to think you'd fallen off before the crash, Newkirk said. I'm happy to see you were just dawdling. Get stuffed, Darren said. If it weren't for me, you'd both be wee splotches in the snow. And I haven't been dawdling. I've been escorting important prisoners about the ship. Aye, I've heard about your mad boy. Newkirk narrowed his eyes. It is true. Is it true he says an army of abominable snowmen are coming to his rescue? Derek chuckled. Aye, his attic's a wee bit scrambled, but he's not that bad, I suppose. Seeing Mr. Rigby with his shirt cut open around the wound, Darren had realized how lucky she had been. If Alec hadn't woke her up, it might have been her laid out on a bed in sick bay, and even if it had only been a squick of frostbite, the surgeons might have stripped off her uniform and seen exactly what was hidden beneath. She owed the boy for that, Darren reckoned. A whistle sounded, and the two fell silent. On the glacier below, all hands were assembling, sheltered by the huge crescent of the air beast's bulk. The captain was going to address the crew at first light. To the east, the sun was just cresting the mountains, bringing a squick of warmth to the air. The Leviathan's membrane was already turning black, ready to absorb the heat of the day. I hope the captain's got good news, Newkirk said. Don't want to be stuck on this iceberg too long. It's a glacier, Darren said, and the Lady Boffin seems to think we might be. There was a stir among the men below, and attention was called as the captain came out onto the snow. The last patch went on at 6 a.m. this morning, he announced. The Leviathan is airtight once again. The riggers arrayed along the spine raised a cheer, and the two middies joined them. Dr. Busk has checked her insides, and the beast seems healthy enough, the captain continued. What's more, our clanker friends hardly dented the gondolas. There may be a lot of broken windows, but our instruments are in fine shape. Only the motivator engines need serious repairs. Darren glanced down at the port engine pod, riddled with bullet holes and leaking black oil onto the snow. The tail engines looked bad as well. The Germans had focused most of their fire on the mechanical parts of the ship, typical clanker thinking. The starboard pod lay beneath the whale, of course, smashed against the glacier. We'll need 2 working engines to control the ship, the captain said. At least we have no shortage of parts. He paused. So our greatest test will be reinflating the ship. Here it comes, Darren thought. Unfortunately, we don't have enough hydrogen. An uncertain murmur spread through the crew. The wee beasties in the whale's gut made hydrogen, after all, the same way people breathed out carbon dioxide. Even after a long winter's hibernation, the ship always swelled back to her old size within a few days. It was normally so simple that everyone had missed the obvious. Hydrogen didn't come from out of the blue. It came from the airship's bees and birds. The head boffin stepped forward. The Alps were once the bedrock of an ancient sea, he said, but now these peaks are the highest in Europe, not fit for man or beast. If you look around, you'll see no insects, plants, or small prey for our flocks. For the moment, our fabs are living off the ship's stores. As long as they remain alive, the ship will process their etc. and slowly refill her hydrogen cells. Etc., Newkirk whispered. That's boffin talk for Claire, Darren replied, and Newkirk snorted a laugh. But when the Leviathan was designed, Dr. Basque continued, none of us imagined landing in a place so bleak, and I'm afraid that the equations are indisputable. All the hydrogen in our ship stores isn't enough to lift us into the air. Another murmur spread through the crew. They were getting the picture now. Some of you may be wondering, Dr. Buss said with half a smile, why don't we simply take hydrogen from the snow around us? Darren frowned. She'd been wondering no such thing, but it seemed like a fair question. Snow was just water. After all, hydrogen and oxygen. It's always seemed a bit suspect to her that two gases mixed up made a liquid, but the boffins were dead certain on the issue. Unfortunately, separating water into its elements requires energy, and energy requires food. The ecosystem that is our home depends on sustenance for nature to repair itself. Dr. Busk's gaze swept across the glacier, and in this awful place, nature herself is empty. As the captain stepped forward again, Darren heard no sound but the wind in the rigging and the panting of hydrogen sniffers. The crew had gone dead silent. Early this morning we loosened a pair of homing trends to carry our position to the Admiralty, the captain said. No doubt one of our sister ships will reach us soon enough, provided the war doesn't get in the way. A chuckle rose up from the crew, and Darren began to feel a squick of hope. Maybe things weren't as bleak as Dr. Barlow thought, but mounting a rescue mission for 100 men in wartime may take weeks. The captain paused, and the head boffin beside him looked grim. We don't have much food in our stores, a little more than a week at half rations, longer if we use the other resources at our disposal. Darren raised an eyebrow. What other resources? The head boffin had just said there was nothing on the glacier. The captain drew himself up taller, and my first responsibility is to you, the men of my crew. The men, not the fabricated creatures. Did he mean taking the beasties' food? But surely the captain wasn't saying, to save ourselves we may have to let the Leviathan die. Barking spiders, Newkirk hissed. It won't come to that, Darren said, pulling the clanker field glasses from his head. My mad boy's going to help us. What? Newkirk asked. Tell the men at the winch to give me some rope, she said. I'm ready to go up. Don't you think it's a bit rude? Newkirk whispered, taking off while the captain's talking. Darren looked out across the glacier, nothing but blank white snow, turning brilliant as the sun rose. But somewhere out there were people who knew how to survive in this awful place, and the captain had said to go up at first light. Quit your dawdling, Mr. Newkirk. The boy sighed. All right, your admiralship. Will you be wanting a message lizard? Aye, I'll call one, Darren said, but fetch me some semaphore flags. As Newkirk went for the flags, Darren took out her command whistle, blowing for a message lizard. A few heads turned in the crowd below, but she ignored them. Soon a lizard crested the wilting airbag and scuttled toward her along the spine. Darren snapped her fingers, and it climbed up her flight suit, nestled on her shoulder like a parrot. Stay warm, beastie, she said. The winch had started to turn, a length of slack rope coiling down the air beast's flank. Newkirk handed her semaphore flags and stood ready at the tether line. Darren gave him a thumbs up and let the knot spill. The air became clearer as she rose. Down near the surface, icy particles flurried on the constant wind, swirling across the glacier like a freezing sandstorm. But up here, above the haze of airborne snow, the whole valley spread out below her. Mountains rose on either side, covered under a patchy blanket of white, the strata of the ancient seabed jutting up through the snow in a broken sawtooth pattern. Darren pulled the field glasses from their case. Where to start? First she scanned the perimeter of the wreck, looking for fresh tracks in the snow. Several spindly trails led away from the ship and back, where crewmen had snuck off to smoke a pipe or relieve themselves, but one that was wider and shuffly looking. Alec's funny shoes at work. Darren followed the tracks away from the wreck. They wandered back and forth, crossing exposed rock wherever possible. Alec had been clever, trying to confuse anyone trying to follow him home, but he hadn't reckoned on someone tracking him from the sky. By the time the footprints had faded into the distance, she was certain he had come from the east, where Austria lay. The sun was full up now, making the white snow glare, but Darien was glad for the warmth. Her eyes were watering from the cold, and the message lizard clenching her shoulder like a vice. Fabricated lizards weren't properly cold-blooded, but freezing air slowed them down. Hang on there, beastie. I'll have a mission for you soon. Darren swept her glasses back and forth across the eastern end of the valley, looking for anything out of place, and suddenly she saw them, tracks of some kind. But they weren't human. They were huge, as if a giant had shuffled through the snow. What had Newkirk said about abominable snowmen? The tracks led to an outcrop of rocks, or what looked like rocks. As Darren stared, the shapes of broken walls came into focus. Along the stone buildings huddled around an open courtyard. Blisters, she swore. No wonder Alec talked so posh. He lived in a barking castle. But she still hadn't found whatever had made those tracks. The courtyard was empty, the stables too small to hold anything so massive. Darren slowly scanned the structure until she found the gate in the castle walls. It was open. Her hand shaking a little, she followed the tracks away from the castle again and saw what she had missed the first time. Another set branched off, heading toward the wrecked airship, and those tracks were fresh. Dare remembered her argument with Alec about animals and machines. He had mentioned walkers, hadn't he? Those crude clanker imitations of beasties. But what sort of barking, mad family had its own walker? Darren swept her gaze across the snow faster now, until a glint of metal flashed across her vision. She blinked, backtracking until blisters. The machine bounced across the snow, shimmering with heat in the cold, like a monstrous, angry tea kettle on two legs. The ugly snout of a cannon thrust from its belly, and two machine guns sprouted like ears from its head. It was running straight for the Leviathan. She pulled the stiff Moor flags from her belt, waving them hard. A light flashed in response from the airship's spine. Newkirk was watching. Darren whipped the flags through the letters, spelling out, "Enemy approaching, due east." She squinted, watching for confirmation from below. The light flashed an answer. "What manner? Walker? 2 legs?" she answered. Another confirmation flashed, but that was all. They'd be scrambling now, trying to mount some defensive against an armored attack. But what could the Leviathan's crew do against an armored walker? An airship was defenseless on the ground. They needed more details. She raised the glasses to her face again, trying to read the markings on the machine. "Alec, you boomerang!" she cried. 2 steel plates hung down to protect the walker's legs, both painted with the iron cross, and a double-headed eagle was painted on its breastplate. Alec was no more Swiss than he was made of blue cheese. "Beastie, wake up!" Darren snapped. She took a breath to steady herself, then said in a slow, clear manner, "Alert, alert! Regards to the Leviathan from Midshipman Sharp. The approaching walker is Austrian. 2 legs, 1 cannon, type uncertain. It must be Alex, the boy we caught. Family on their way. Maybe he can talk to them." Darien paused for a moment, wondering what else to say. She could think of only one way to stop the machine, and it was too complicated to cram into a lizard's drafty wee attic. "End message," she said, and gave the beastie a shove. It scuttled away down the ascender's rope. As she watched its progress, Darren let out a soft groan. Away from her body heat, the freezing air was slowing it down. The beastie would take long minutes to deliver the message. She peered across the glacier again, using only her naked eyes. A tiny flash of metal winked at her from the snow, closer to the airship every second. The charging walker was going to arrive before the lizard. Alec was the key to stopping the machine, but in all the ruckus, would anyone think of him? The only way to make sure was to go down herself.